I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
King Charles did not raise his voice. He did not summon the entire family, issue a public warning, or give Queen Camilla one final opportunity to defend herself. Instead, he entered a private room at Sandringham, placed a sealed directive on the table, and signed the order that destroyed an ambition she had protected for years. With one controlled movement of his pen, the king took back the estate she believed was slowly becoming hers. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles remained seated after the ink dried. The directive, a formal written order carrying his authority, placed Sandringham estate under his control and removed Camilla from future planning, household decisions, cottage allocations, and any expectation that she would command the property after his reign. Sandringham was not simply another royal residence. It held Christmas traditions, childhood memories, and the continuity linking one generation of the crown to the next. The king read the final page twice, while a legal advisor waited in silence. His hand hovered above the paper, then settled beside it as he said, "This must return to the family, not become the reward of one person's ambition." The advisor understood. Charles was not adjusting a schedule. He was closing a future Camilla had treated as settled. Camilla sat in a nearby drawing room when an aide entered carrying a short notice. She opened it expecting a routine briefing, but her expression changed before the second paragraph. The queen consort stiffened, pressed her fingers against the page, and placed it face down without finishing. She had lost more than influence. The order cancelled arrangements that would have allowed her relatives to use cottages, attend shooting weekends, and receive estate hospitality after Charles's death or abdication. The blow deepened when Camilla learned where authority would move next. William had been named the estate's future steward, meaning he would carry responsibility for its care, while Catherine would help guide its family, charitable and ceremonial use. The prince did not celebrate. He closed the folder and remained silent, knowing the decision would be seen as his gain, although his father had made it. Camilla understood that lawyers had not created this crisis. Something personal had pushed Charles beyond hesitation. Months earlier, a conversation had crossed a line he could no longer ignore. She knew which moment it was, and she knew he remembered every word. But before the palace could understand why the king had acted so decisively, it had to confront the truth. Sandringham was never merely an estate to Charles, and it had never been merely a home to Camilla. To the public, Sandringham represented Christmas walks, church appearances, and carefully arranged family photographs. Behind closed doors, however, it had become the center of three different dreams. Charles saw inheritance and duty. Camilla saw permanence and protection. William saw a responsibility he had never requested but could no longer avoid. Now, with one signature dividing those futures, every private hope attached to the estate had become a source of pain. Charles carried memories into every room. Sandringham reminded him of his mother's discipline, his father's final years, and the private traditions the royal family protected away from government control. Those traditions mattered because the estate was personally owned by the monarch rather than managed as public property. To the king, preserving it meant keeping the family's emotional history intact for those who would come after him. Camilla had imagined something very different. For years, she had quietly pictured Sandringham as her secure royal base, a place where loyal friends could gather, and her relatives would always feel welcome. The queen consort believed the estate could protect her influence even after Charles's reign ended. She had survived public hostility, palace suspicion, and decades of judgment. In her mind, permanent access was not greed. It was proof that she finally belonged. William felt no sense of victory when the private briefing reached him. The Prince of Wales, the title given to the monarch's direct heir, read the plans in silence before closing the folder. He turned to Catherine and admitted that he did not want Sandringham to feel like something taken from another person. The future king understood what control meant, but he also understood how easily inheritance could become a weapon inside a wounded family. Catherine chose her words carefully. The princess reminded him that boundaries were not cruelty, and that inherited responsibility could become dangerous when private promises were allowed to override the next generation. She urged William to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis, without treating Camilla's loss as a triumph. He listened, but the discomfort remained. Duty had placed something valuable in his hands, while leaving someone else humiliated. Camilla entered the small estate office, expecting to review renovation plans and future guest arrangements. Instead, she found the table cleared. The fabric samples were gone, the sketches had vanished, and her personal stationery had been removed from the desk. She stood motionless before asking an aide where everything had been taken. The answer was brief. All future planning now required approval from Charles's office. The rejection deepened when Camilla requested an immediate meeting with her husband. Charles refused. The king sent a restrained message, stating that he would speak only after William had received the full briefing. She then learned that informal privileges promised to her relatives had also been cancelled, leaving her exposed before people who believed her influence was permanent. Camilla's sadness hardened into suspicion. Someone had told Charles about those promises. Someone had provided proof. The answer lay buried in private conversations, altered plans, and one disastrous Sandringham gathering that transformed the king's unease into a final, irreversible decision. The order reclaiming Sandringham did not begin in a solicitor's office. It began at a private winter dinner, months before the signature, when King Charles entered the dining room earlier than expected and heard Queen Camilla describing the estate's future as though it had already been settled. The guests fell silent. One chair scraped against the floor, and in that frozen moment, the monarch realized that plans were being made around his inheritance without his permission or his knowledge. Charles had already sensed that something was shifting. Guest rooms had been reassigned without clear approval, long-serving staff had been quietly asked where their loyalty would rest, and private family spaces were being discussed as though they could be handed out. Sandringham was a privately owned royal estate, meaning it belonged personally to the monarch rather than to the government. That made every promise about its future personal. Camilla had grown more confident over time. She spoke to close companions about creating a relaxed household after Charles's reign, one where her friends and relatives would still feel protected. The queen consort believed years beside the king had earned her moral authority over the estate. She did not see herself as taking anything. She saw herself as securing what loyalty had promised. Then came the dinner. Charles entered early and heard Camilla assuring two guests that cottages would remain available to her family. She added that annual gatherings would continue at Sandringham, whatever changes came next. The king stopped. She saw him, and the room collapsed into silence. Charles waited until the final guest had gone, before asking why she was assigning property that was not hers to distribute. Camilla answered that she was protecting people who had stood beside her for decades. He pressed again. She replied that Sandringham should not automatically become another Wales possession. The sentence cut deep. Charles heard it as a challenge to William's future and to the line his late mother had worked to preserve. He said nothing. Instead, the monarch walked into the corridor, lifted a framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth II with her grandchildren, studied it, and ordered it returned to the main family sitting room. Days later, an aide delivered a private memorandum, a written internal record, detailing proposed staffing changes, cottage allocations, and guest arrangements discussed without Charles's approval. The king read every page and quietly instructed his legal team to examine each privilege, promise, and expectation tied to Camilla's use of Sandringham. Charles did not confront her again. He waited until every loophole was closed. Months later, with every promise cancelled, husband and wife were brought together inside Sandringham for the confrontation both had known was coming. There were no aides inside the room when Charles finally confronted Camilla. No private secretary stood nearby to soften the language. No courtier could redirect the conversation toward protocol. The king remained beside the fireplace, while she held the directive in both hands, demanding to know why years of loyalty had ended with a legal order. His answer was colder than anger. Loyalty, he told her, did not grant ownership over his family's inheritance. Camilla had demanded this meeting for days. The queen consort wanted no staff member present, and Charles agreed because the argument was no longer about palace procedure. The directive, a binding written command issued under the king's personal authority, had already removed her from Sandringham's future. Now husband and wife had to face what the document could not explain. Camilla spoke first. She reminded Charles that she had steadied him through scandal, supported his reign, and endured years of public hostility. She said a secure place at Sandringham was not greed, it was recognition. The king listened without interrupting, but his silence only sharpened her fear. Charles finally answered. Her mistake, he said, was never loving the estate. Her mistake was promising its future to others while treating William and Catherine as barriers instead of heirs. The monarch told her that Sandringham carried memories, traditions, and obligations that could not be reshaped around private loyalties. Camilla's control began to crack. She asked whether she would be expected to leave the moment Charles was gone. Her voice faltered as the truth settled over her. Under the new arrangement, she would not command the household or decide who stayed there. She would return only by invitation. Camilla placed the papers down sharply and pushed them toward him. Charles did not reach for them. He looked at her and said, "They are already signed." The words ended every illusion of negotiation. Camilla reminded him of a promise made years earlier, when he had assured her that she would never again be left without security or a respected home. Charles did not deny it. The king confirmed that she would remain financially protected, personally cared for, and surrounded by a household worthy of her position. But protection was not control. She would not inherit authority over Sandringham, its cottages, its staff, or its traditions. Camilla then named William. She accused the prince of pushing his father toward this decision. Charles stopped her immediately. He said the review was his order, his responsibility, and his final judgment. Yet one truth remained. Charles admitted that a private conversation with a trusted royal had convinced him that further delay would be dangerous. The legal order carried his signature, but the moral pressure behind it came from someone who understood Sandringham's history and Camilla's growing influence more clearly than anyone expected. King Charles may have possessed the authority to reclaim Sandringham, but authority alone had not moved him. For months, he hesitated between protecting his marriage and protecting the royal inheritance. Then Princess Anne entered his private study, carrying no legal file, no prepared speech, and no demand for punishment. She asked only one question. When the next generation looked back, would they believe he had preserved the family or surrendered its most personal home to avoid conflict? Anne understood Sandringham in a way few others could. The estate was not simply a grand residence or ceremonial symbol. It was a private family inheritance, shaped by discipline, sacrifice, and continuity. Unlike courtiers, she spoke to Charles as his sister, not as his subject. She wanted no cottage, no title, and no future control there. That made her warning impossible to dismiss. Charles sat opposite her without aides present, turning his mother's signet ring around his finger. A signet ring is a personal royal seal, often tied to family authority and memory. The king stared at it, while considering the cost of reclaiming the estate. If he acted, Camilla would feel rejected. If he delayed, promises made without approval could harden into expectations that William would later be forced to break. Anne watched him struggle and refused to soften the truth. She told Charles that avoiding Camilla's anger was not the same as protecting her dignity. By allowing informal assurances to spread, He had made the eventual loss more painful. Silence, she warned, was no longer kindness. It was surrender. Charles finally admitted what frightened him most. The king did not want his wife to feel discarded after spending much of her life waiting for acceptance. Camilla had endured public hostility, private suspicion, and years of uncertainty. He feared that taking Sandringham from her would confirm every insecurity she had carried into the marriage. Anne then shared what she had heard during a documented private conversation with household staff. Camilla had referred to Sandringham's future household as "my circle," and spoken of William's access as something that would need to be managed. The princess said those words changed everything. This was no longer about security. It was about influence. Charles stopped turning the ring. He placed it flat on the desk and said Sandringham must remain with the direct line of succession, the family path through which the crown and its responsibilities pass to the next heir. It could not become a separate court built around his widow. The king also knew the law was on his side. Sandringham was privately owned by the sovereign, allowing him to decide its future stewardship without parliamentary approval. Within days, reporting lines changed, guest permissions froze, and locks were reassigned. The argument had ended inside Charles's study, but across Sandringham, the consequences were only beginning, and each practical change made Camilla's loss impossible to ignore. Power rarely disappears in a single dramatic instant. More often, it vanishes through small denials. A key that no longer opens a door, a meeting removed from a diary, a member of staff who now waits for someone else's approval. At Sandringham, Queen Camilla experienced that erosion within hours. The estate still looked familiar, but every corridor carried the same message. She remained the king's wife, yet the future she had imagined there no longer belonged to her. Charles moved quickly once the order took effect. Estate managers were told to report directly to his private office, the small team responsible for handling his personal decisions, while major long-term plans would now require consultation with William's representatives. The change mattered, because control over staff meant control over the estate's future. Camilla could still stay beside the king, but she could no longer approve extended visits, assign cottages, invite large private groups, or authorize permanent alterations. Camilla discovered the new reality at the planning office. She inserted her key, turned it once, then again. Nothing happened. A nervous staff member approached, opened the door, and explained that the lock had been changed under direct instruction. Several household employees watched from nearby. The queen consort forced a smile, thanked him, and walked away before the anger rising inside her could become public. The humiliation followed her into private life. Camilla telephoned relatives who had been promised future stays and explained that those arrangements were no longer guaranteed. One conversation ended in a long silence. She tried to soften the message, but she could not hide the truth. People who had trusted her influence were now discovering its limits. Estate staff then began an inventory, a formal list separating personal belongings from property that permanently belonged to Sandringham. Furniture, artwork, gifts, and private possessions were recorded one by one. Camilla understood what the process meant. The palace was not merely changing authority. It was preparing for a future in which her place had been carefully defined and contained. Catherine received a very different message. The Princess of Wales was invited to help shape future charitable events, children's programs, and family traditions at the estate. She accepted cautiously, knowing the invitation signaled that her influence was replacing Camilla's ambitions. William refused to celebrate. When an aide congratulated him on his new authority, the prince replied that there was nothing triumphant about watching a family relationship collapse. He understood the duty, but he also saw the suffering it had created. Camilla saw that hesitation as her final opening. With formal authority closed to her, she turned toward the one person she believed might still soften the future, and arranged a meeting without Charles, Catherine, or palace officials present. When Queen Camilla asked William to meet her alone, she did not arrive carrying legal arguments. She brought no advisors and offered no threats. For the first time since the order was signed, she spoke not as queen consort, but as a woman afraid of becoming temporary inside the family she had fought to join. Yet William entered the room carrying fears of his own, about his children, his mother's memory, and the inheritance he could not abandon. Camilla chose a modest sitting room away from Sandringham's central household. No aides remained, and neither side allowed the conversation to be formally recorded. The Queen began carefully. She was not asking to control the estate again. She wanted William to support a permanent right for her to use one cottage and hold a small family gathering there each year after Charles was no longer present. William listened without interrupting. The prince understood that a permanent right meant more than occasional hospitality. It would create an enduring claim inside a private royal estate, a personally owned property passed through the sovereign's family line. Such an arrangement could later grow into a separate household with its own loyalties, expectations, and influence. Camilla finally admitted what Sandringham had meant to her. The estate had become proof that she was no longer an outsider, waiting at the edge of royal life. Losing authority there made every year of acceptance feel conditional. She told William that she had spent decades fighting to belong, only to discover that belonging could still be withdrawn with one signature. William answered gently, but he did not bend. Her personal security was not in danger, he said. Charles would protect her, and he would honor any fair arrangement his father approved. But Sandringham could not become a parallel center of influence competing with the sovereign's household. Camilla reached for her tea, saw her hand trembling, and set the cup down untouched. William moved the sugar bowl aside, giving her space to regain control without drawing attention to her distress. Then Camilla asked the question both had avoided. Was this truly about governance, or was she still being judged through the pain surrounding Diana? William paused. He admitted that his mother's memory shaped his caution, but he refused to make her the weapon in this decision. The prince said the future now concerned George, Charlotte, and Louis. He would not leave his children an estate divided by promises, private claims, and another inheritance battle. Camilla stopped resisting. She asked only whether Charles would guarantee her a dignified home. William said yes. He would personally support any fair settlement approved by the king. But Sandringham would remain with the crown's direct family line. Their meeting ended without affection, yet also without hostility. What had been argued in private soon became visible in public, and one carefully watched arrival at Sandringham told the country more than any palace statement could have revealed. The palace released no detailed explanation of the Sandringham order, but it did not need to. The truth emerged through a single public moment. On the morning of a family service, King Charles arrived first, followed by William and Catherine with their children. Queen Camilla stepped from a separate vehicle moments later, paused beside the gate, and allowed the Wales family to walk ahead. That brief hesitation became the image printed across Britain and the symbol of a royal future being reordered. Charles had hoped to contain the decision within private family channels, but the story moved too quickly. Broadcasters interrupted regular coverage, newspapers prepared special editions, and the palace was forced to confirm that Sandringham's future governance had been formally revised. Governance meant the system deciding who controlled the estate, approved its use, and shaped its long-term future. The official statement called the change long-term family and stewardship planning, carefully avoiding any direct mention of Camilla's lost authority. The public understood anyway. One national newspaper placed the family's arrival across its front page beneath the headline, "The King's House, the Heir's Future." Charles stood beside William, while Camilla remained several steps behind. The image carried more force than the statement because it showed hierarchy without explaining it. The king was present. The prince was advancing. The queen consort was no longer leading the estate's future. A small crowd gathered near Sandringham's gates as the family entered. Some applauded Charles for protecting the direct succession line, the order through which royal responsibility passes to the next heir. Others expressed sympathy for Camilla, arguing that decades of loyalty had earned her a stronger place. Camilla heard a photographer call William's name. She briefly lowered her eyes, then straightened her shoulders and joined Charles, without attempting to move ahead of the Wales family. Her control was careful, but the pain beneath it was clear. William refused to treat the moment as a victory. When a broadcaster asked whether he welcomed the new arrangement, the prince answered that Sandringham belonged to generations of family responsibility, not to any individual's triumph. Catherine remained beside him, understanding that even success could carry suffering. Charles ended the public uncertainty during the reception. Standing beside William, the king placed one hand on Camilla's arm. The gesture showed that his marriage remained intact, even though authority over Sandringham had been settled. No exile had occurred. No public rejection had been declared. Yet the message was final. By the time the family left Sandringham that afternoon, the argument over ownership had ended, leaving only the deeper verdict about love, duty, and the limits of royal power. In the end, King Charles did not take Sandringham back, because he had stopped loving Camilla. He reclaimed it because love could no longer be allowed to blur the boundary between personal protection and royal inheritance. The estate would not become her private kingdom, nor would she be abandoned without dignity. William would inherit responsibility, Catherine would help preserve its family purpose, and the next generation would receive Sandringham without the shadow of a hidden struggle. Charles confirmed the final arrangement without hesitation. Sandringham would remain under his sole control for the rest of his lifetime, before passing into William's stewardship, meaning the future king would carry responsibility for protecting and managing the estate. Camilla would hold no separate governing role there. Yet the king also made clear that she would not be cast aside. Camilla received a guaranteed residence elsewhere, continued financial support, household staff, and the dignity of remaining beside her husband. The queen consort understood that the order had not been designed to punish her existence. It had been designed to limit her authority. That difference mattered, but it did not make the loss painless. Charles faced her one final time in private. The king admitted that he had allowed expectations to grow because he feared conflict and wanted to protect her sense of belonging. Camilla answered with a truth of her own. She had mistaken emotional closeness for permanent entitlement, believing that love beside the throne would eventually become control over everything connected to it. Camilla then reached into her handbag and removed the estate's master key. She placed it in Charles's open palm. He closed his fingers around it, but he did not smile. The gesture was not a victory. It was the quiet ending of an illusion both had allowed to survive for too long. William accepted the burden with restraint. The prince promised his father that Sandringham would remain a family home, not become a monument to his own authority. Catherine added that its future should center on family gatherings, rural stewardship, public service, and teaching George, Charlotte, and Louis that duty meant preserving something for others. Camilla lost the estate she had coveted, but she did not lose her marriage, title, or personal security. Her deepest consequence was simpler and harder. She had to accept that belonging to the royal family never meant possessing everything around it. Charles had drawn the boundary himself, sparing William from inheriting both Sandringham and an unresolved family war. The monarchy chose continuity over private ambition. The doors of Sandringham remained open to Camilla, but its future no longer belonged to her ambition. Charles had made his choice, William had accepted the responsibility, and the monarchy had preserved one of its most personal inheritances before private desire could divide it forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.